Dear colleagues, dear all, welcome at this pre-recorded humanitarian talk to be broadcasted during the humanitarian forum hosted by the European Union, the European Humanitarian Forum, and the title of the talk is Changing the Way We Manage Disasters, linking anticipatory action and social protection to protect agricultural livelihoods from shocks. My name is Davide Zappa. I work as a regional disaster preparedness thematic expert for DG ECO across the Asia-Pacific region, based in Bangkok, Thailand. In March 2021, the European Commission adopted its communication to the European Parliament and the Council on the EU's humanitarian action, focusing on new challenges to be at the same time addressed through same principles. At the core of the communication stands the message that better preparing for future risk, where complex, multi-layered hazards manifest, so to say, compound risk in the policy discourse, is urgent. The communication strongly reinforces that the EU is committed to scale up anticipatory action in different humanitarian contexts and regions to respond to this call for action. In its updated disaster preparedness policy document, which the DG ECO likewise issued in 2021, this is called the DP Guidance Note, DG ECO has prominently featured how we view preparedness as a way to promote anticipation, earliness, and flexibility as critical elements to manage disasters more efficiently and effectively and mitigating their impact. The first FAO DG ECO programmatic partnership was launched in 2021 to increasing capacity and scale for anticipatory action, including through social protection systems. For those of you who are less versed with this modality, let me briefly summarize that programmatic partnership mark the EU's commitment to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of aid in an era of unprecedented humanitarian needs. Programmatic partnerships seek to increase flexibility and longer-term strategy, bolstering local partners working on the front lines of the worst humanitarian crisis. We are honored today to be reflecting what we have learned so far and the road ahead with an excellent panel comprising colleagues representing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the Government of the Philippines, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, with each of whom DG ECO is closely collaborating in Asia. I will introduce the panelists in the next few minutes, but let me just conclude before we watch a short video to introduce the discussion that we are really looking forward to this exciting exchange today. Thank you, and over to the video.
We live in an increasingly fragile world. Climate hazards and conflicts are becoming more frequent and intense. This is increasing the number of crises around the world and driving humanitarian needs to unprecedented levels. To meet these growing needs and competing priorities, we need new tools to make assistance more effective and ensure we limit the impacts of crises before they become more devastating and costly. Simply put, we need to change the way we manage disasters. When the international community responds to crises, it's often helping people after the shock. But in some parts of the world, one emergency can cause another. With each event, a family loses assets that provide food and income, and they struggle to rebuild their livelihoods. Responding after a shock takes a toll on people and it drains limited aid budgets. FAO aims to tackle this with anticipatory action, a set of tools to address problems early on from a crisis. This is early warning information that tracks changes to climate, act as predictive impact of a hazard, like a drought or a flood, roll on intervention lives and livelihoods. Once early warning information signals the potential threat to farmers, financial resources are quickly mobilised through FAO's Anticipatory Action Fund. This allows FAO and partners to act quickly. So, what are anticipatory actions? They can be cash transfers to help fishing communities, they could also include drought resistance to keep herds alive throughout a drought. Whatever the action, they are all designed to make sure people have access to locally grown, nutritious food and can hold on to their livelihoods even when disaster strikes. Evidence shows that for every dollar invested in these activities, families can receive a return of $7 because they avoid the loss of livelihoods and gain other benefits in the process. Instead of rebuilding what's lost, anticipatory action builds the capacity of all communities to protect their assets and security and to become resilient to shocks. That's how anticipatory action can help crises and make aid more effective. Now is the time to change the way we manage disasters.
Thank you for the video, Mrs. Dunja Duganovic, FAO Senior Emergency and Resilience Officer, will now offer an outline of a programmatic partnership as a recall at the start of this humanitarian talk. Dear Dunja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Davide. It's a pleasure to see you all and really an honor to be here at the European Humanitarian Forum, speaking about the new partnership and exciting venture between FAO and DG ECHO in scaling up anticipatory approaches to crises. So allow me a few introductory words. The latest IPCC report confirms that climate change, including more frequent and intense events, is causing widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people. As a result, millions of people have been made more vulnerable as well as hungry. At the same time, a number of non-abating and protracted conflicts are driving further consistent increases in humanitarian needs and budgets. This is unsustainable. A strategic shift from responding to predictable shocks with the same measures to anticipating their impacts has the potential to break the cycle of growing dependence on humanitarian aid. This approach, known as anticipatory action, establishes risk monitoring systems linked to flexible finance and action and delivers support to protect people ahead of forecast shocks. Since 2015, FAO has been systematically investing in anticipatory action as a key part and a key component of its work in preventing food crises. As of today, we have implemented over 30 anticipatory action projects in over 25 countries, protecting the livelihoods of many vulnerable families ahead of shocks. Evidence shows that anticipating crises can curb food insecurity of vulnerable communities while providing a more efficient and a more dignified kind of assistance. And these are just the short-term gains. People who have faced shocks often resort to negative coping strategies, such as in the case of farmers, selling their animals, their lands, migrating. There are many long-term consequences on their lives. The benefits of protecting people ahead of shocks reach far into the future and are part of wider, crucial disaster risk management efforts. Anticipatory action can be delivered in a variety of ways. One option being explored is national social protection systems. These systems are designed to target and provide support to vulnerable parts of the population, with the overall emphasis to reducing poverty and food insecurity. Linking this to anticipatory action means making better use of existing infrastructure to reach and protect at-risk populations ahead of forecast shocks. We are seeing more and more initiatives such as this, for example, with ASEAN, who just released their guidelines on disaster-responsive social protection to increase resilience. Linking these two approaches furthermore has the potential to facilitate collaboration across sectors, protect development gains, strengthen coordination between humanitarian and development actors and national governments, and enhance the capacity of national stakeholders. Recognizing this, DG ECHO's latest disaster preparedness guidance mainstreams anticipatory action and social protection, and DG ECHO launched a partnership with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN as one of the leading agencies on anticipatory action for agricultural livelihood protection. Our partnership builds on ongoing work at the global, regional, and national levels, focusing on building up anticipatory action systems, creating coherence with partners, and critically exploring how to better link this to social protection systems to ensure sustainability of this approach in the long run and uptake by national governments. Thanks to the ever-growing body of evidence on the effectiveness of anticipatory action in preventing human suffering and reducing humanitarian needs at lower costs, anticipatory action has gained significant political momentum. Various UN resolutions, the G7 Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Crisis Compact of last year, the DG ECHO Guidance Note on Disaster Preparedness, the EU Adaptation Strategy, and the US Prepare Initiative, just to name a few, are all calling for a scale-up of anticipatory action. At the UN General Assembly high-level event in September 2021, co-hosted by OCHA, Germany, and the UK, more than 75 governments and 60 aid agencies, international financial institutions, and private sector companies committed to acting early, and many donors made new pledges of support for this kind of preventive work. Yet, anticipatory finance still represents a minimum share of total humanitarian finance. Some studies point to less than 3% of humanitarian financing to be prearranged and available when warnings materialize. More commitments are needed from all parties, governments, development, and humanitarian partners. Funding to scale up anticipatory action should be allocated to all the key steps required to mainstream this approach, including the establishment of early warning systems, strengthening analytical and operational capacities, as well as making flexible financing rapidly available for implementation, including via social protection systems. And finally, to conclude, this is why our FAO and ECHO pilot programmatic partnership represents a new and critical step towards achieving a system-wide shift from reactive to anticipatory and social protection approaches to food crises. This can be achieved by leveraging strong existing collaboration with governments, regional organizations, communities, and others involved in work on the ground, such as including the Anticipatory Action Task Force, composed of FAO, the World Food Programme, the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, START Network, and UN OCHA, as well as the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, Anticipation Hub, and many other regional and national technical working groups. With that, I thank you very much for your attention and wish you a great event on this increasingly important topic. Thank you. Davide, over to you.
Thank you, Dunia, for your very important introduction. I will now offer some brief complementary points from a DG ECHO perspective. As highlighted in the Asia-Pacific Disaster Report 2021 published by the United Nations ESCAP, the regional riskscape has of late been reshaped and expanded. This is due to converging and cascading natural hazard-induced shocks. Climate change, La Niña, continues to warm the world, exacerbating impact of multiple events. And at the same time, biological hazards such as the COVID-19 pandemic are incumbent on us. Above and beyond Asia-Pacific, those who are most vulnerable and marginalized are often the least prepared for acting early, ahead of the recurrent and protracted hazards manifestation, including situations of conflicts, crisis, and violence, which have further compounded their vulnerabilities. Understanding the risk to design more effective humanitarian programming requires establishing partnerships at all levels. This is why our programmatic partnership happens at a real critical juncture. We have joined our forces to act before a crisis hit and forge a sustainable and resilient future, leaving no one behind. DG ECO's approach is always to put people at the center of what we do, leveraging investments we make to reinforce local preparedness and response capacity, whenever possible, working at system level. Evidence that anticipatory action saves lives, reduces needs, and contributes to protect development gains is growing. This presents an unequivocal, powerful message. Investing in preparing for and to act early pays dividends. For example, the FAO-DG ECO programmatic partnership will be further cementing achievements, learning, and frameworks developed through the recently concluded DG ECO and FAO collaboration called Scaling Up Focus-Based Financing, Early Warning, Early Action, and Shock Response to Social Protection, with innovative use of climate risk information for disaster resilience in ASEAN. This initiative leverages the combined capabilities of both institutions to support the definition of the ASEAN disaster responses social protection to increase resilience guidelines, which contributed to the delivery of an unprecedented response by ASEAN member states in terms of scale, speed, and magnitude of their response to the challenges posed by COVID-19 to their own citizens. While celebrating these achievements, we should be clear that more remains to be done after substantive foundational work has been laid, as this is of vital importance to build upon this step in the right direction. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment for everyone to scale up efforts and invest in a more proactive approach to humanitarian crisis. On this, we will now hear from our excellent panel. Let me briefly introduce who is on the panel before polling each and every panelist to present their own views. So we start with Dr. Riante Gelante, who is the Assistant Director, Head of Division of Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance of the ASEAN Secretariat. We also have Director Clifford Cyril Riveral of the Department of Social Welfare and Development from the Government of Philippines. Welcome to you both, dear colleagues. From the Food and Agriculture Organization, we have Dunia Duganovic, which we just heard, who is the Senior Emergency and Resilience Officer, as well as Mrs. Hang Pham, who is the Senior Resilience Officer based at the FAO Regional Office for the Asian Pacific. With no further ado, let me pose the first question to our first panelist, who is Mrs. Hang. Dear Hang, what is the available evidence on anticipatory action in Asia? What have we learned and what is still missing? The floor is yours. Thank you. Dear Hang, you are on mute.
Thank you, Davide. Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today in this event. And on these questions, well, you know that the Asia regions, perhaps because we are most vulnerable to multiple disasters, we have been also at the forefront of the anticipatory action agenda. And we have seen many pilots being implemented, for example, in the Philippines, Mongolia, and Bangladesh for drought, cold waves, and floods. And when we look at evidence on anticipatory actions, we can think of two types. One is on impacts, and the other one is on process learning. Now, firstly, on the impact, we have evidence that shows that acting early is a cost-effective model. And this is needed more than ever as humanitarian aid budgets are being pinched by the increasing frequency and intensity of multiple disasters, be that climate-related, human-induced, conflicts, as well as the pandemic. FAO studies have shown that for every $1 invested in anticipatory actions in our regions, we can have a return of up to $7 in avoided losses and added benefits. For example, in Mongolia, our beneficial livestock keepers who received animal care kit and cash before the severe winter cold had fewer of their animals die. In Bangladesh, the vulnerable communities who received anticipatory cash ahead of the flooding were more likely to evacuate and save their livestock, essential agriculture and fishing equipment, and they were also less likely to borrow money to cope with the flood in the aftermath. Now, you may be aware of the World Bank further estimate that if we upgrade early warning system to support early actions capacity in all developing countries, we can save every year 23,000 lives and avoid losses in the range of 300 million to $2 billion. Now, of course, these benefits go beyond money. When we speak to the communities and local governments, we found that anticipatory interventions can support resilient building, curb malnutrition, protect food security, and provide a more dignified humanitarian model. Communities that we spoke to indicate that by protecting family sources of food and income throughout crisis, anticipatory action help them to preserve the progress they have made in improving nutrition and education. So very clearly, acting early ultimately means investing in a more resilient future. Second aspect is process learning. This is very critical for us to reflect on the process of establishing, implementing, and monitoring anticipatory actions collectively with governments and partners. If we take this learning, we will understand how anticipatory actions can fit into the wider systems and become a new way of managing disasters. Anticipatory action needs to be sustainable and financially viable. And therefore, we need to capture how the systems, not only disaster risk management, but also hydromet services, social protections, and other relevant systems in the country are set up. And how can anticipatory actions be integrated in these systems? We have limited evidence on this aspect at the moment. More we can and needs to be done to showcase the mechanics of anticipatory action. So reflecting on these two aspects, it occurs to me that we have very compelling evidence that provide us the encouragement that we are moving in the right directions, but we clearly need more. We need efforts at scale and tested across different hazard, different vulnerability contexts, and national system for us to understand what will work and what may not work. We need to work with partners to gather evidence in a collective manner so that we are addressing all aspects of vulnerabilities and complementing funding across the different sectors. We also need to be honest about our challenges and struggle with the approach so that we can think solution-based collectively. And finally, exploring the cost difference of anticipatory actions to humanitarian response. This is a critical piece of evidence that we need to showcase the importance of acting earlier and how it differs from early response or early recovery. With that, I stop here and over to you, Davide.
Thank you very much, Hang. Quite a lot on evidence, very relevant. Can I perhaps call kindly Dr. Rianti Jalante to discuss and reflect about what we have seen on evidence, what evidence is out there on anticipatory action, and how and what ASEAN is now developing on anticipatory action framework based on this evidence. So the question for you, Dr. Jalante, is how can this evidence help ASEAN member states and member states in general to take the agenda forward? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to the ASEAN Secretariat to be involved in this European Humanitarian Forum 2022. Thank you to DG ECHO and FAO in particular for the invitation and their supports on the ASEAN project on mainstreaming anticipatory action approach and disaster responsive social protection into ATMOR Work Program 2021-2025 as the continuation of the previous project of the scaling up forecast-based financing / early warning, early action, and disaster responsive social protection with innovative use of climate risk information for disaster resilience in ASEAN. Southeast Asia is one of the most at-risk regions in the world. Countries are exposed to a variety of climate-related hazards, including floods, storms, typhoon, drought, and extreme temperature. In 2019, over 152 million people in the region, that is 24% of the population, were living within areas experiencing flood events. Over close to 400 million or 62% of the population were living in the area that are also exposed, on the other hand, to drought events. So even though Southeast Asia is also exposed to geophysical hazards such as tsunamis and earthquake, by far the largest share of economic and human damage in the region is attributed to hydrometeorological and climatological hazards, especially tropical cyclones, floods, and drought. So climate change is making some hazards more frequent and intense in the region. There are signs that climate change is contributing to the rising of rainfalls associated with tropical cyclones, average peak wind speeds that are also increased. So highlighting the latest IPCC report working through, it confirms that climate change has worsened the impacts on people, settlement, ecosystem, and infrastructure. So on the work of anticipatory action in disaster management. So ASEAN understands anticipatory action as an approach which systematically links early warning and to action plans, delivery mechanism, and funding modalities that are designed to protect communities, assets, and infrastructure when a hazard poses imminent danger. So anticipatory action pilots across the globe, of course, shows that anticipatory action can help people, and that's also what we see in the ASEAN region. For example, the recent typhoon Rai/Odette, and we also have participants, a representative from the Philippines here. Preemptive relocation and early warning indeed save life. Cost-benefit analysis, including experience of IMS, show that, as highlighted before by Representative Fofao, every $1 invested in anticipatory action, families can gain up to $7 in benefits and avoided losses. So undertaking anticipatory action at the regional, national, and local scales will require strong and shared understanding of the concept between the regional, national, subnational actors, member states, and partners. So ASEAN is currently planning to develop, or in the process of developing, the ASEAN framework on anticipatory action in disaster management, through our cooperation with FAO and supported by DG ECO. We plan to launch this framework at the sidelines of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in May in Bali, Indonesia. So the framework aims to help advance anticipatory action implementation in the ASEAN region. It represents our landmark commitment to move the anticipatory action agenda forward in the region in supporting the long-term goals for a climate resilient future. It also seen as a vehicle to accelerate regional policies and support ASEAN in implementing global frameworks, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and Sustainable Development Goals. So looking ahead, this framework will highlight prioritized actions and work plan at the regional and national level to move forward with anticipatory action agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rianti, as eloquent as usual, and in explaining your regional ASEAN outlook, very important reflections. I wonder if we can now request Director Riveral, if he can help us to reflect about what does this mean at country level. So, Director Riveral, If I may, one of the roles of the Department of Social Welfare and Development of the Government of the Philippines is to lead on disaster response. The Philippines have also put a really significant effort in developing anticipatory action frameworks for priority hazards. So my question to you is, how can the evidence and learnings on anticipatory action help the Philippines to move forwards towards systemic shifts from reactive to anticipatory approaches to hazard? Director Riveral, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Davide. A pleasant afternoon to each and everyone, and of course the other panels who are with me today. Disaster management and climate change are linked to social protection, which is the primary mandate of the Department of Social Welfare and Development as the Vice Chair of the Disaster Response Pillar under the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. As such, we continuously improve our policies and plans in terms of disaster response management, and we affirm the thin line between the anticipatory action and the actual disaster response operation, considering the necessary interventions to increase the adaptive capacity, primarily of the poor and the disadvantaged, who are at the verge of becoming extremely vulnerable to the effects of the disaster and climate change at a very short lead time. Anticipatory action is one of the key for a better, efficient, and effective disaster response in the Philippines. We engage in various consultation dialogues with international partners in highlighting and mainstreaming anticipatory action as one of the strategies in disaster risk reduction and management. Although the anticipatory action approach is relatively new, we have seen its great potential to mitigate the impact of disasters and to minimize the magnitude of work during disaster response. In order to facilitate systemic shift to anticipatory action, the government of the Philippines continuously work on the following components. First is the anticipatory action approach utilizes the current social registry system or the listahanan from our local language lista, which means a list or a record. A record of those who are the poor, the vulnerable, and the disaster-prone population. Second, the action approach is being mainstreamed on the established social protection programs such as the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program and the Sustainable Livelihood program, boosting the resiliency of Filipino families. The third is the AA approach facilitates the shift towards economic resiliency of the disaster-prone populations by ensuring that their livelihoods are resilient prior to the onslaught of disaster. Likewise, on the different levels of the government, triggering triggers per hazard and clearly delineating the roles and responsibilities at each level and is executed during or through simulation exercises. Although it is anticipatory, we are unable to determine the coverage and magnitude of the damage, of which there is a challenge on the limited funding that we have. We acknowledge the and collaboration with development partners, most especially the UNFAO, who had been a lead in this endeavor, and other stakeholders, is crucial to weave this approach in the frameworks of the Philippine government. And lastly, as we implement the anticipatory action, the government has to establish funding mechanism for this purpose and set enabling policies that would provide access to donor organizations and international to provide funding, piggybacking on existing beneficiaries, or conduct parallel implementation with the government. The government of the Philippines, through the Department of Social Welfare and Development, will continue to lead the institutionalization of the anticipatory action from the national government down to the local government units to ensure that protection of the most vulnerable and prevention, mitigating injuries, more so loss of lives due to the adverse effects of disasters. Thank you and a pleasant day to everyone.
Thank you, Director Riveral, for your very insightful words sharing the vision and achievements of the government of the Philippines in the anticipatory action space. As you mentioned repeatedly, social protection investments in your intervention, noting that in the last few years, the Department of Social Welfare and Development of the government of the Philippines has made an impressive progress in terms of embedding a shock response to social protection approach within the new national social protection policy. Could I ask you to be so kind to share once again with us your reflection about how do you see the anticipatory action approach supporting these national efforts? Director Riveral, once again, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davide. Yes, in 2021, the Adaptive Shock Responsive Social Protection, or the ASRSP roadmap, was adopted by the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, paving the way for institutionalizing this approach in our country. This roadmap embraces the whole of nation approach, wherein a national protection system will be the first responder to predictable shocks following an ex-ante mechanism in reducing risk for the most vulnerable. Although the widely utilized approach on implementing livelihood programs in the are focused on prevention, mitigation, and early recovery, such as risk resiliency program, cash for work, and emergency cash transfer. We also recognize that the anticipatory action approach is a key element in protecting the livelihoods of disaster-prone populations by having forecast mechanism embedded in the existing social protection programs in the Philippines. It could ensure that livelihoods of the vulnerable populations are also protected, lead to the prevention and loss brought about by disasters. Anticipatory action approach can shift the perspective of lawmakers and key decision makers in the country towards disaster risk reduction to disaster risk management, wherein the main vision is gearing towards resilience, which can be achieved by establishing system-based response and integrating multiple social protection programs of the country. Specifically, as we progress through this, with the support of the National Council, the government, we move forward to the following. First is the framework, which has already been provided, but we still need to establish an enabling policy that will govern, guide the national, regional, and the local level implementation and operationalization. Within the department, we are now in the phase of crafting internal guidelines of this anticipatory action. As we all know, we need to align implementation mechanisms and procedures to existing government rules and regulation, along with its alignment to the long-term plans of the country. Second, identifying fund sources in order to provide clarity to actual implementers at the local level or the local government units. And lastly, appropriate capacity and capability development should be provided to ensure continuity of the implementation. The adoption of the ASRSP framework is a huge step forward, and we affirm that we still face the many faced by many intensive activities that will commence its operationalization and actual implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again, Director Riveral. If I can zoom collectively with all of you once again back to the ASEAN regional level, I would like to invite Dr. Jalante to speak about how can anticipatory action be integrated into climate, disaster risk management, and social protection strategies and funding mechanisms. Dr. Rianti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator, Mr. Davide. Allow us to respond to this second question. As we have briefed and outlined before, ASEAN is developing the ASEAN framework on anticipatory action in disaster management due to be issued this year. So anticipatory action must be part of comprehensive disaster risk management framework. In ASEAN, each country will develop and strengthen their own national and subnational systems for anticipatory action in line with their DRM system, guided and supported by regional institution and policy. And we have seen example from the Philippines on how the implementation of anticipatory action at the national level. So the followings are relevant documents that are advancing anticipatory action in the agenda of the ASEAN. We have the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, ASEAN Declaration on Adaptation to Drought, and ASEAN Regional Plan of Action for Adaptation to Drought 2021-2025. In addition, we have ASEAN Declaration on Strengthening Social Protection, ASEAN Guidelines on Disaster Responsive Social Protection to Increase Resilience. We have ASEAN Regional Framework on implementing the Declaration on Strengthening Social Protection. We have ASEAN Disaster Management and Emergency Relief Fund or ADMAR Fund, ASEAN Disaster Risk Finance and Insurance Mechanism, as well as Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility. So it's very important that we identify how anticipatory action have been considered within this existing framework, and then later, once we have this framework, identify the relevance of anticipatory action in strengthening the implementation or to be considered in the implementation of these guiding documents. So let me highlight how each of these key documents relevant to anticipatory action. So the 2015 Declaration on Resilience of ASEAN Communities to Peoples and Peoples to Disaster and Climate Change. This is the first time significant step on our commitment to institutionalizing disaster risk management and climate risk at all governance level. Of course, this declaration was adopted in 2019. No specific word on anticipatory action, but we believe this put the strong foundation on how anticipatory action being proactive needs to be considered with all in disaster risk management cycle. Then, of course, we have ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response. This is the main foundation for cooperation across disaster management. The ADMAR is implemented into the 5-year ADMAR work program and very clearly in the ADMAR work program 2021-2025, as well as the previous cycle 2016-2020, highlighting anticipatory action to be implemented as part of the work program. Taking one example, for example, the ASEAN response in standard operating procedure for emergency regional standby arrangement and coordination of joint disaster relief and emergency operations (SASOP). So there is considered it's considered or it's identified on the need for decision points by which humanitarian crisis flashpoint is triggered and allow for forecast-based response. So including anticipatory action and financing. So what we have done is to look at the relevance of anticipatory action on this guiding mechanism. We have one ASEAN One Response principles to achieve faster mobilizing greater resource, faster response, greater response, as well as enhancing solidarity. So anticipatory action offers a method of translating this commitment into action, so that we can demonstrate, of course, our global leadership, regional leadership, but also mitigating disaster impact at risk population. So looking ahead, this framework highlights prioritized action and work plan for the regional and national agenda. It's aligned with the global frameworks, and what's importantly, it provides guidance for countries to work together, work with partners based on the collective understanding and point of reference to scale up and accelerating progress in making anticipatory action as an integral part of disaster risk management in the region. Thank you very much, Mr. Davide.
Thank you, Dr. Gelante. We are coming towards the end of our discussion, but the question that Dr. Gelante just elaborated upon is of vital importance. So I would like to ask the same question to FAO and specifically to Mrs. Hang. So the question to you, dear Mrs. Hang, is how can anticipatory action be integrated into climate disaster risk management and social protection strategy and funding mechanism? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Davide. Well, you know that FAO, with our mandate to ensure food security for all, improve nutrition and end poverty, for us, anticipatory action approach provides us with innovative solutions to work in both humanitarian and development to fulfill these missions in the challenging context of increasing disaster risks and climate emergencies. Now, first, the integration for FAO happens at the policy level. It's emphasized in the new FAO strategic framework as part of different program priority for us, including strengthening disaster preparedness and emergency response and building resilient agri-food systems. The FAO new climate change strategy that is being finalized also highlights anticipatory action as part of our climate change adaptations actions. Now, in the regions, the way that we do with integrating anticipatory actions in our activities happens in a few ways. First is in our effort to help the agriculture sector strengthen its capacity for disaster risk management and climate change adaptation, starting with planning and strengthening the investment decisions capacity. So we work on vulnerability and risk assessment, strengthening the use of climate information and other risk informations, and help the sectors identify action in disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. So the new generation of these plans in countries like Mongolia, Cambodia, and Laos, PDR, as well as Timor-Leste, include anticipatory action as an approach for the agriculture sectors to strengthen the disaster preparedness and respond, helping resilient agricultural livelihoods. The second thing we do is we integrate it in our services and support to farmers through the strengthening the capacity to use climate services and agriculture extension services. In countries like the Philippines and others, we strengthen the seasonal and short-term forecast, providing the agrometeorological bulletins and early warning that include advisories for farmers to cope with natural hazards as well as pests and diseases. Now, our Farmer Fin School or Climate Fin School include training for farmers and farmer organizations to use these advisories in reducing the risk to their farm and also better prepare for disasters. The third way that we're doing is we support the member countries to include anticipatory actions in the funding proposal to leverage climate finance, such as the climate change adaptation window of the Global Environment Facility or the Green Climate Fund. We have several examples of this, but a very interesting project is the new Green Climate Fund project in Timor-Leste, where FAO, together with the UN Environment Programs, RAMS, the Red Cross, and other partners, bring the different government agencies together, including the hydromet agencies, the disaster management agencies, and the agriculture and other sectors to strengthen early warning systems, strengthen disaster preparedness capacity. And within that, FAO works specifically to develop anticipatory action system for flood and drought, demonstrating how it will help, strengthen the disaster preparedness and resilient building in the country. And through all of this effort, again, a few reflections I have. First, as we know, we always say disaster risk management is a task of all sectors and everybody. But to translate this principle and political commitment into practical actions by sectors take time and capacity building. Second, I want to emphasize again the need for good understanding of the national system so that we identify options that will work, particularly when it comes to mobilizing domestic resources and shifting the expenditures from ex post to ex ante, pre-disasters. And last but not least, I want to reiterate the point that Dr. Rianti said, that anticipatory action has to be part of the disaster risk management system. We can't treat anticipatory action as a silo approach or just in the humanitarian box. And this is very critical to make sure that it will be vital and sustainable, as well as scaling up. Thank you, Davide. Over to you.
Thank you, Hang, and this concludes our discussion today. Let me thank our wonderful panel once again prior to moving to the next step of the talk. We have heard from Dr. Rianti Jalante, the Assistant Director, Head of Division, Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance Division of the ASEAN Secretariat. Thank you once again, Dr. Rianti. We also heard from Director Riveral, Department of Social Welfare and Development from the Government of the Philippines. Thank you, Director Riveral. You are now also on video. And finally, from Mrs. Hang Pham, the Senior Resilience Officer from FAO Regional Office for the Asia and Pacific. Thank you once again, and we will now show a short video from the Anticipatory Action Task Force to introduce some of the policy reflections and asks that this very interesting way of cooperating in between key partners in anticipatory action has recently issued. So we can now show the video. Thank you.
Extreme weather events are causing destruction in all three regions. Storms, floods, heat waves, diseases, and other types of hazards affect millions of people. Crises around the world are intersecting and compounding each other, increasing the risk of conflict, displacement, and hunger. The poorest and most vulnerable are hit hardest, adding to record levels of humanitarian needs in decades. By forecasting when hazards will strike, analyzing their risks, agreeing on actions, and enabling financing ahead of time, humanitarian organizations and communities can act before disasters hit. This way, anticipatory action saves lives and livelihoods and ultimately preserves people's self-sufficiency. It's a faster, more efficient, and more dignified way to protect people against predictable crisis. Wanted to shift the humanitarian system to be more proactive instead of reactive, and for anticipatory action to reach more people, cover more locations, address more types of hazards, and create lasting impacts in the lives of the most vulnerable. More can and must be done. But what will it take? First, when a crisis is imminent, every second counts. Because of that, we have to invest in early warning and readiness to anticipate, especially at the local level. Second, fast help also requires fast and pre-arranged funding. That is why we need to expand flexible, predictable, and coordinated financing. Third, different events in the world increase the risk of disasters. This reality holds for the application of anticipatory action to a wider range of hazards. Fourth, we must find the appropriate solutions for each challenge. This is only possible through exchange collective learning, coordination, and partnerships all around the world. Fifth, for anticipatory action to become business as usual, it must become an integral part of national disaster management systems. These recommendations reflect our years of experience in more than 60 countries as the Anticipatory Action Task Force. We are formed by 5 organizations: IFRC, FAO, WFP, OCHA, and START Network. Collectively, we have put our resources and expertise into anticipatory action to save lives and livelihoods. The Anticipatory Action Task Force promotes a wider reach of anticipatory action, provides technical support, helps build evidence, and strengthens synergies with global initiatives to support countries. Together, we are calling on communities, organizations, and governments to join us so more people can benefit from anticipatory action. Let's make humanitarian assistance faster, more efficient, and dignified by acting early on predictable crises.
Great. So the discussion we had today is very encouraging, but we also need to collectively keep doing more. Let me share with you, in my vest of moderator, 3 key takeaways that formed in my mind as our excellent panelists spoke during our discussions a few minutes earlier. Firstly, to best define how and what should be next, it is important we keep debating what works and learn from what doesn't. The year ahead presents several opportunities to collectively better prepare for and act early for all hazards, threats, disasters, and crises, no matter if they are induced by human, climate, or natural hazards. As we heard today, the programmatic partnership offers us an important opportunity to make anticipatory action an integral part of the design of humanitarian programs and delivery of humanitarian assistance through contributing further evidence that this works. For this, I cannot emphasize enough how crucial credible metrics as part of any initiative, program, project, deliverables are, and therefore we must encourage all of us together to systematically invest in this endeavor. Secondly, we also need to continue be realistic up front. By the very nature of risk, some won't materialize, and if they do, the impact on different people may vary. We must therefore be clear that anticipatory action will not be feasible or appropriate everywhere or cover all needs. Lastly, the best use of limited humanitarian financing is to test anticipatory action approaches, which should be then financed by states within their own systems, inclusive of shock response social protection. We are clear that the role of DG ECO is not to substitute states in financing anticipatory approaches, but rather to promote their replication and sustainability potential. We must harness our practice and elevate our message to its full potential, as preparing for and acting early ahead of shocks and crises is pressing. On this note, allow me to thank once again our keynote speakers, panelists, all their colleagues and different persons who have supported the organization of this humanitarian talk. And I'm really encouraged by the stimulating and thought-provoking discussion we have had today. We at DG ECO are looking forward to keep contributing to identifying clear and measurable commitments, to close the identified gaps and scale up anticipatory action, guided by the Climate and Environmental Charter, through further enhancing our partnerships to the benefit of those who are living in risk and in need. Thank you once again very much. This marks the conclusion of our humanitarian talk.
Thank you.